Welcome to Mindful Crossroad, the place where ancient paths and modern minds converge on this episode. I'm Roman, and today we're diving deep into a forgotten yet vital cornerstone of early Christian spirituality, Nepsis, or the practice of watchfulness, and its connection to the modern psychology that we now study. We're looking at the crossroad of psychology and ancient wisdom. There's a lot of things that can overlap within history, and today we're just gonna kind of look at the first version of science that we had in our world and developed as human beings. And today with me is Sarah Oli, who is a student of religion and psychology both, as well as having a minor in education. Welcome, Sarah.
Hey. Quick note, I'm actually only a psychology major. My two minors are religion and education, but I've probably taken more classes in those than psychology. So.
Close enough, right? So let's kind of start with the definition. I love my definitions. So, Nepsis, it's a Greek word, and it comes from or defined as spiritual watchfulness, inner vigilance, attentiveness of the soul, so to speak. And from my understanding, it comes from the Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yeah, a little etymology that I found was that the term is kind of taken from the first epistle of Peter, which uses nepsis as a verb form in the imperative mood. So it's like a urgent command to vigilance and awakeness. This is in verse 8 of chapter 5. In the NIV translation, it reads, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." So, just communicating like watchfulness and continual vigilance.
And in the start of this, right, the term was made by Christian monks, right? And they kind of believed that the human mind was a battlefield and that every thought, every impulse, every decision that we make as human beings needed to be watched carefully. Okay. Let's go to some of the history and the development of that. Through my research, I think I narrowed it down to between the 3rd and 5th century as being the start of this practice. So that's when the quote-unquote desert fathers and mothers started popularizing this idea. And they're the ones that equated thoughts as spiritual movements within the mind that could be evaluated and had the ability to attack the soul, so to speak.
Yeah, so with that kind of definition in mind, I found that I'll try to say this, Jesukeos, kind of defined nepsis as the continual fixing and halting of thought at the entrance to the heart, which can also be understood as mind, because those in the Hebrew and like biblical understanding are the same thing, more or less.
Right. And then if we fast forward from the 5th to the 10th century, the 10th through 14th century, we see there's more of a new center of focus in the Eastern Orthodox Church around what this would be. That's when it kind of takes on that monastic practice, right?
Yeah, and this is kind of when the Jesus prayer came about, which is just a form of prayerful stillness centered on saying a specific phrase. And in case anyone's unfamiliar, the Jesus prayer is a fairly popular and common thing in Catholicism and I think Orthodox traditions, and it's just a simple short prayer meant to be recited as you breathe in and out. And it just says, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me." And then some versions will add a sinner to the end of that. So yeah, you can kind of see how Nepsis ties into that in using a specific phrase to focus on that's centered on Christ to keep the mind focused and to ward off distraction and spiritual delusion and other thoughts that aren't kind of approaching the ends of holiness.
And then if you fast forward again to like 1782, there was a pretty big book, although some would debate that it's not a book. It's a spiritual laboratory, a collection of writings that was compiled by centuries worth of monks and mystics and so forth that was meant to be lived through. And it's called the, oh, my Greek is terrible, Philokekala?
Ilocalia, maybe? I don't know. That's my best guess if I can't read it in the Greek.
But that was made mostly by Saint Nicodemus the Hagorite and Saint Macaros of Corinth. Those were the main compilers.
1700 compilation goes crazy. You're welcome.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah, so, why does all of this matter? This is like a really odd topic for us to choose.
You're the one that chose it, man.
I had a little bit of prompting from something I saw.
The connection is the fact that it correlates to how modern psychological practices are unfolded through actual development of patterns of the mind. It's showing that there was a spiritual technology of sorts that went into practice, and that practice has been evaluated through time. It has also been mocked, but we're seeing that there is actual connection to what the human mind requires and old spiritual practices. And so that's the crossroad that we're examining here, is how those two overlap with each other. And it's really, really fascinating stuff. Some of the more so modern words for something like Nepsis would be like cognitive distortion or mindfulness or meditation, just that vigilant inner awareness of what is going on in your mind and what is going on around you and how to bring that into focus so that you can control your mind. I had a teacher in high school, and his thing was always control your mind monkeys. You have a lot of things going on in your brain, a lot of thoughts jumping around, and you need to be able to rein those in and focus. And so things like Nepsis, things like meditation, they're all focusing on that same vein, that same practice.
I think there's a TED Talk on the mind monkeys.
I believe that's the Panic Monster is the TED Talk.
Easy mistake. Yeah, but all of this thinking about the different connections, both ancient and modern, to these concepts of mindfulness and meditation, kind of has me thinking about like what the original was and whether like Nepsis or different concepts of meditation found in like Buddhism or Hinduism originate, and if the kind of ideas flow well from one religion to another or from religion to like secular world. Yeah, so I kind of looked at when certain things more or less came about, and the earliest is kind of ancient roots of mindfulness in Hindu yoga disciplines in India, which is 1500s BCE. And then around 400, 500 BCE, you have Buddha teaching mindfulness as part of the Four Noble Truths, which then inform the four foundations of mindfulness. And then after that, in 250 CE, Taoism developed breathing and visualization techniques for health and longevity of life. And then 600 CE, Zen Buddhism emerges in China, kind of emphasizing direct experience and meditation. And then something that I think we'll touch on a bit later is in 1979, John Kabat-Zinn founded MBSR Secular Mindfulness Program. That was one of the first instances of taking it out of a religious context. But that had been led up to in the years prior, especially in the United States and kind of the Western world. And then one I forgot to mention is in 1200 CE, Sufism, which is a mystical branch of Islam, practice meditation and chanting. And within all of that, there's also, I know, roots of the same kind of thing in Jewish history, as well as some other religions. So even though those aren't listed, they do exist.
And I think that just kind of like ties into like metaphysical subscriptions, something that I like to say that I coined, but I didn't. But like your religious beliefs or your views about the metaphysical world through philosophy, like that all ties together no matter what that subscription is, whether it be Hinduism, Taoism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they all, or even atheists, it all ties back into trying to find a way to understand the human condition or the human mind or the world as it is. And all of them end up converging towards one truth. And finding what that truth is pretty much the entire point of being human, in my opinion. And I love finding all these connections. It's my passion is to find all the connections, all the intersections between all the different studies. And so myself as a psychology student and also a theology student, right? Those are the things that I'm looking for. So like with cognitive behavior therapy as like the real big push in modern day psychology, right? That started in like the mid early 2000s, like 2005 to 2010 was when that became like a really big push. And you still see that like in all the literature that I'm reading for like classes and whatnot. Like cognitive behavioral therapy just pops up again and again and again. And that really just goes into that mindfulness aspect, that figuring out what is going on in your own personal mind and trying to work through that. Basically forming the separation of thought from identity, which I think is the crux of what Nepsis is.
Yeah, I think it definitely touches on it. And then also, I think similarly, it's interesting to me that in the rise of CPT and these ancient traditions being used in a more secular context, the ways that those methods mix with culture and make something different is reminds me of the concept of syncretism, which is usually in a religious sense, which is just the merging of different cultural belief systems or religious belief systems and like schools of thought. So you can kind of see how in the more Western culture of individualism and more predominantly secular thought in academia, this deeply religious concept gets adapted.
Yeah. And that adaptation probably was culminated too in the 70s, like you mentioned, with John Kabat-Zinn. He was originally a biologist, I believe, by trade, but he wanted some sort of science-based method to reduce stress, anxiety, depression, the things that we now commonly see, like so commonly see, like everyone, far as like the stats are showing, like we have 70% of Caucasian females in the UK that all have a stress and anxiety diagnoses at this point, which is a major uptick in those fields. So we saw in the latter part of the 20th century the increased awareness of this rising factor, and then the secular field attempting to figure out a way to negate that. And so that's what Zen's method was supposed to help with. It was supposed to be about resiliency, those fun little buzzwords, about being fully present with your thoughts, looking and examining them without grasping onto them and holding onto them, and doing so above all without judgment to self. So that was a really big shift within psychology as a whole, and that is definitely rooted in the Buddhist meditations that you were talking about.
I wonder how you're supposed to correct yourself without judging. Seems difficult.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, but I think it's in how we look at the word judgment, right? Are we examining for good and bad, or are we telling ourselves we're a good person or a bad person based off of our individual thoughts, right? Like, people will have those like kind of outlandish thoughts that are out of character and like immediately like wave them off. But like if you were to judge yourself off of an individual thought, right? An individual bad thought. For instance, oh, I'm driving. What if I just like, I don't know, cross the double yellow line just for funsies, right? And go into incoming traffic. That's like one of those like outlandish thoughts that a lot of people have had, but they don't act on it. And you're not going to judge yourself based off of that one thought. But if you look at that thought and go, whoa, why in the world did I think that, right? So I think that's where, especially in Western culture, we've taken the word judge and we've misconstrued it away from its original meaning. Because you have to examine something, but you don't have to make a final determination on something. There's a slight nuance to that. But if you just like do the bare bones, oh, judge as good or bad, and make everything black and white, that's where things can definitely go downhill really quickly, especially mentally.
Yeah. That reminds me of your distinction of identity versus thoughts, and that being what these practices do. And also just of the importance of going back to ancient traditions and practices, because there's also this concept that I've engaged with recently. I think there's a more full name, but it's called an examen. And it just kind of, it's not quite the same, but it is about thinking through your day and thinking about different aspects. And not necessarily judging them, but like examining them, see where they are, where you want them to be, and like, yeah, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So like combining all of this together, right? And like kind of going into the psych world as well. One of the people that kind of made that branch over was Carl Jung, right? Um, Very famous psychologist of this past century. And he had the concept of the shadow, which was essentially a representation of the spiritual influence over mankind, but without ever saying it was truly spiritual. He himself originally wasn't so spiritual, but as he evolved and as he branched off into his own comfort zone, he started pushing the idea that there was a spiritual influence into mankind. And so around the same time as we're developing all of these more atheistic viewpoints in the Western world, this was a man that was kind of bridging the two together. And when you think about like Nepsis, having something like the shadow is what Nepsis is looking out for. And that's kind of what the meditation aspect would also be watching for. So you're balancing your inner shadow with your true self and figuring out which one you are, which kind of goes into that identity aspect.
Yeah, I guess then you also have to know what your identity is, because otherwise your thoughts form your identity. Complicates it a bit.
Yeah, and so you have to ask yourself, what is the self? Which gets into a whole nother rabbit hole, right?
I guess also a nuance to these more ancient traditions of watchfulness as opposed to mindfulness. There's almost an aspect of redirection and like taking on a new thought in Nepsis or in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, which seems like it would be shaping a new identity because neurologically your thoughts guide your words and actions, and then your actions form your character, and all of those shape your brain networks. So these practices, when considered within their religious roots, are meant to be transformative and are meant to have, some of them, most of them, are meant to have an end goal or something that you are trying to attain rather than just being present, which I think is an important part of the religious aspect. And as you might be able to tell from the way that I talk about this, I'm a pretty firm believer that for these practices to actually, for people to actually encounter these practices in the ways that they were intended to, it's important to have some sort of deeper religious or spiritual aspect rather than just the mindfulness, which is a good regulation tool, but I think that there comes a point that a lot of people feel in modern therapy as well, where they don't feel like they can go anywhere and they're just in a space thinking about trying not to think.
Yeah, I can kind of concur with that, of therapy being a good tool, but definitely not an end all be all. Because it's not, and it's not meant to be. Therapy is an ongoing process of the self trying to understand how to regulate, and therapist jobs are to give you tools to help you regulate better, right? They're not there to make everything better, they're there to help you make yourself better. And when it comes to trying to make the thoughts stop, right? Like that's one of the things that I've observed a lot of people want to do. They just want to make their brain quiet. And Nepsis was the way that the ancients did it. And in more modern times, what we attempt to do is just shove it full of more and more and more information. So your social media apps, your Instagram reels, your TikToks, what have you, constantly playing music in the background, your white noise machines, having television on in the background, just so that your brain has something coming into it, or you even go the route of like drug and alcohol abuse, just to get the thoughts to quiet, your brain to quiet. And the point is not to overwhelm your brain into numbness, but to actually bring yourself through peace. And so the ancients, their wisdom would be to find it your peace spiritually. And I believe modern psychology is still trying to figure out its equivalent to what inner peace, true peace, would look like. I don't think modern science gives us a solution, but the ancients sure seemed to think that their solution worked.
Yeah, I mean, the focusing on something outside of yourself is an important aspect of the way that they did things. Where if you're focusing on your thoughts and feelings and whatever else is in your environment, that can be really difficult. But once you're focusing on something else, maybe like reciting something repetitively, it brings you to a state of meditation and focus on that thing such that it blocks out everything else. And I think that especially for people who struggle, at least initially, with clearing their mind, that's a really important aspect that we can learn.
For sure. And I think that is the biggest contrast, right? The focus on the self versus the focus on something outside of you, especially with, whatever your metaphysical subscription may be, that's something typically being larger than you are in the realm of the universe. And when you take that more humble route of I am not a god, but rather there is a God bigger than I, you bring yourself to a place where you can actually sympathize and have compassion for others that are struggling because you are no longer the center.
So I guess we talked about a lot about the religious aspect, but we should shift kind of to what science is behind this right now, which pushes some of Carl Jung's work to the side, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you kind of push Carl Jung off to the side a little bit,
R.I.P.
and then you look at what is called default mode network or DMN, you have scientific studies that show awareness of thoughts reduces the activity in the region of your brain that is associated with rumination. And so with that, most of your brain essentially becomes idle or still. And so that idle state is when you're daydreaming, when you're rehashing the past or projecting the future. So those moments where you're playing the what if game with yourself, right? Or you're trying to do some social scripting for a conversation that you're going to have with your boss the next day, and you're really not looking forward to it. So you're trying to figure out what you're going to say and how they're going to react, and then blah, 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 blah. And then it's, oh my gosh, what's going on?
That sounded personal.
Ah. But yeah, DMN is the mental autopilot. It plays a role in creativity, memory, self-referential thinking, anxiety, etc., etc. But here's where it actually gets interesting. All right, Harvard did a study in 2015. They posted it on their Harvard Gazette page. I don't know, their newspaper. I read it, and it's a two-part story, but they used fMRI scans to show that when people engage in meaningful meditation, that's kind of hard to find, but they that's what they're getting at. Simply observing their thoughts without judgment. Again, what does that mean? Kind of hard to get at, but when they do that, it decreases the activity in the default mode network. Therefore, you're going to lead to things like decreased anxiety, decreasing the what if game. And what that could then be easily translated into is that this practice is a top-down cognitive regulation of sorts. And when you're thinking top-down versus bottom-up, you're looking at just how the brain is processing, whether it's building upon things or deconstructing them. And to do the deconstruction method, it gives your brain the ability to process the event, and therefore, if you can process the event, you can, well, get over it. So it's a really interesting parallel between ancient wisdom versus modern science. And, you know, that's what we're here to discuss, really.
Yeah, I think also it's important to note that top down and bottom up are used in many, many, many very confusing ways, especially in cognitive science. But the general sense is through empirical evidence, of which I had to read way too much of over the past semester, was that we can do top down, but we're always still going to be influenced by bottom up factors. So the random things happening in the room around you are going to catch your attention inevitably. And our ability to regulate top down generally correlates with working memory capacity, which indicates differences in ability dependent on the person. So, different types of meditation and mindfulness that are altered to be accessible to each person, at least in my opinion, are important so that people can actually engage in them in a way that's useful to them instead of sitting in a room being distracted by every single thing around them if they have, I don't know, ADHD.
Do you mind giving like a brief overview of top down versus bottom up?
Top down is kind of understood as you are allocating your attention, and like in a visual search task where there's things on a screen and you're told to look somewhere, that would be you directing your attention to a certain point. Whereas bottom up is when your attention is captured by peripheral stimuli.
Thank you.
That's not all encompassing, and there's also different words used to refer to each of them. But at least in visual search tasks, that's kind of how it works.
So yeah, we kind of went over a lot. Again, like most of the conversations that I do here, there's no real end to how far you could take this, how many overlaps that you can find, how many intersections between ancient wisdom and modern science there are. But like, we covered a good amount of ground. Thank you very much, Sarah, for being here. Very much appreciate it.
Of course.
What do we go over today? We began with the definition of what Nepsis is, the ancient Christian practice of watchfulness. We explored how this is a seemingly mystical practice, but it mirrors many of the core principles in modern psychology, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or the default mode network. We considered how Nepsis invites us to gently step back from the whirlwind of thoughts that, constantly project themselves onto us and make their ways into our mind. And we asked the question of what is the self? What determines the identity? Is it the thoughts? Is it the judgment of the thoughts? Or is it just watching the thoughts as they move? So yeah, Nepsis, the modern science, they're not necessarily separate roads. They're just different avenues to get to the same truth of what is it to be a human with a mind that thinks. Well, say if you like what you heard today, give us a like and a follow, and we'll be back next month.